When Dr. Henry Indiana Jones Jr. first whipped his way onto silver screens in 1981, it was an instant success, reigniting interest in the old-school adventure serials that the film itself was clearly paying homage to, while also inspiring a whole raft of imitators and copycats all across the globe, from America to Australia, England to Egypt, Italy to India, and Thailand to Turkey. Everyone was getting in on the action, which is good news for me, as I have a weird fascination with this particular genre of film, for better and usually for worse, since in a shocking move that I'm sure is going to take all of you by surprise, many of these knockoffs are varying degrees of rubbish. That doesn't necessarily mean they can't be enjoyed, it's just that some are going to be more enjoyable than others, and often in very different ways. Some, for example, are genuinely good, while others go so far in the opposite direction, they end up looping back round and becoming so bad they're good. Somewhere in the middle, though, are the dull, the unpleasant, and the generic. And I should know, since I've sat through pretty much every single one of these things I could find. I'm not just counting movies either, since TV networks would also try their hands at this sort of thing from time to time. They didn't tend to last very long, but it doesn't matter. They exist, so I've found them. And in this series of videos, I'm going to be sharing everything I've uncovered, from big budget Hollywood blockbusters to small rinky-dink productions made for pennies. Sifting through all of these films and TV shows, I struggled for a way to categorize them. I can't really sort them by country of origin, since quite a few of them are co-productions, and I can't really sort them by where they're set, given the globe-trotting nature many of them have. And once you've seen your 20th jungle, you'll stop caring where the next one's supposed to be. The best I can do is to go through these in order of when they were made, which isn't ideal, but it's something. And it does mean I can stop waffling on in this overlong preamble and start talking about the things themselves. Before I do though, keep an eye on the side of the screen, since that's where I'll be showing whether the thing I'm talking about is available on DVD, Blu-ray or streaming. Generally speaking, the good stuff tends to be easily available. The bad stuff, if there's any justice in the world, has been buried by the sense of time. So let's get excavating. Before Indy's first big screen adventure in 1981, there were a few films that pipped it to the post, which share similarities to the sort of events the Man in the Hat would get up to. So even if they're a little too early to count as actual rip-offs, I still feel they're worth discussing. If we go alphabetically, then the first is Race for the Yankee Zephyr, an awkwardly named movie that starts with clearly fake 1940s war films. You can tell by the quality being too good, despite the filter they've slapped over it, which establishes that a plane filled with gold bullion probably didn't make it to its intended destination. That bit's also shown in the war film, which, yeah, that doesn't work. Fortunately, the rest of the movie is much better shot. There's actually some really impressive helicopter shots which establish our main characters, Australian deer farmers Barney and Gibson. After screwing up the hunt for new stock, Gibson, played by Donald Pleasance, in full over-the-top drunk mode, stumbles across the now washed-ashore wreck of the plane and grabs some of the war medals inside. Back in town, he sells them, which gains the attention of a rather unsavory treasure hunter, who, after basically threatening Barney to give up the location of the wreck, then starts chasing the pair before just straight up trying to kill them. Surely being polite and pleasant from the off, rather than menacing and evil, would have worked out better for everyone? At first glance, this doesn't really have much in common with an indie caper, and to be fair, it's only got minor elements that are similar. Things like the hunt for a MacGuffin, villainous rivals who are clearly evil. They're all in suits, it's a dead giveaway. A race to treasures from World War II, some improvised escapes, and so on. At the end of the day though, this film was kind of a hidden gem that I wanted to highlight. And to be brutally honest, I wanted to start this list with a film that was kind of fun rather than, well, what's coming next. And this film is just that. Fun. From Donald Pleasance playing a constant drunk, a little too well at times, to Ken Wall putting up with basically none of his antics, to Pleasance's estranged daughter getting swept up in the adventure, to George Peppard, best known from the A-Team, oozing menace as the bad guy, to some beautiful scenery shots, there's quite a bit to enjoy here. It's not an amazing film, the score can veer wildly depending on the scene, the editing's a little bit frenetic and often feels like brief mid-scene shots are missing, and the chase scenes can be a little overlong, but it's entertaining in the right places, and even if it is a little corny overall, there's a lot to like, and it's clear that people behind it had fun making it. It may not necessarily be the most grand or epic film, but sometimes just being fun is enough. Having said that, making any sort of Hollywood movie, let alone something on the size and scale of an Indiana Jones type adventure style one, generally takes a fair bit of time to plan out and produce. But if you're not concerned about things like strong narratives, well-rounded characters, or riveting action, you can generally get things done much quicker. At least I assume that's what happened with Sphinx, which is based on Robin Cook's novel of the same name. Robin Cook incidentally normally writes thrillers with a medical twist since he trained as a physician, so Sphinx is a bit of an outlier for him. Watching this adaptation, you can tell. As with the Yankee Zephyr, calling this film an indie ripoff is kind of untrue, since it made it to theatres 4 months before Raiders first opened. But while Yankee Zephyr is only passingly similar, Sphinx has a much more familiar type of setup, and even some of the same cast, including John Rhys-Davies, making the first of many appearances in this video, so comparisons are more apt. Clearly, audiences were more than happy to wait for The Man in the Hat, as Sphinx cost around $14 million to make. To compare, Raiders cost $20 million, and only brought in a hair over 2, making this a big box office bomb. People were right to hold off. Despite a fairly brisk and relatively entertaining opening, establishing how a historian is chasing down the lost tomb of some random Egyptian person, after that the film shows its true colours by becoming rather bland, with very little action and editing that makes what action there is feel awkward and clunky. Which is also how the dialogue feels, which is a big problem considering how much exposition there is. You'd never guess this was a book first. Really, the film only briefly comes to life when bad things happen to people, usually the female lead, which seems to happen far too much and is uncomfortable every single time. If you ever wanted to see what happens when a man is torn apart by horses, this film's got you covered, within the first 5 minutes no less. Why you'd want to see that is another matter entirely, but you do you, I guess. Even with that though, the acts of violence are few and far between. It doesn't help that Leslie Ann Down makes for a pretty poor protagonist, though that's down almost entirely to the script, not the actress, who's clearly doing her best. But it's a pretty thankless role in a pretty thankless film that also has one of the most embarrassingly pathetic car chases I've ever seen, a romance that basically comes out of nowhere, and a deeply underwhelming ending with a totally jarring final line that feels like a quip straight out of a Bond film.
Find anything? Nothing to write home about.
And it's not being overtly rubbish, the film's mostly just dull and dry, which makes sense given it's set in Egypt. On the whole though, you could probably understand why I didn't want to start the list with this one. It just isn't a particularly entertaining adventure. If you want something that's actually meant to be entertaining, the same year also gave us Ci troverò un amico, troverò un tesoro, which is poorly pronounced Italian for Who Finds a Friend Finds a Treasure. Filmed in Florida, it's one of many movies starring Italian duo Terence Hill and Bud Spencer, who got their break in a series of spaghetti westerns before they eventually branched out into other genres like comedies, which is supposedly what A Friend is a Treasure is. I say supposedly because I didn't laugh once throughout the film. So in that regard, it's a big fat failure. But just because it isn't laugh out loud funny doesn't mean it isn't enjoyable, because it is. It's bright, it's colourful, it's well paced, and it's got 2 solid leads, with Hill being the cheeky chappy con man who bounces off Spencer's grumpy tough guy fairly well. And the plot about a not so deserted island having a bunch of treasure works decently enough, though the Japanese soldier who still thinks the war is going on, and the rather flamboyant pirate gang might raise a few eyebrows with a modern audience. Ultimately though, despite having a couple of things in common with an indie-style caper, A Friend is a Treasure is really just a buddy comedy, quote-unquote, that's a fine enough film in its own right, but isn't really what we're looking for this list. And I bring it up partly because I know someone will mention it in the comments otherwise, but mostly to illustrate the difference between a light-hearted romp and an epic adventure film of the sort this video is primarily focused on. Like I say, while it's not laugh-out-loud funny, this is a charming little adventure, and if you're willing to put up with some slightly quirky dialogue and some slightly too slapsticky humour, or attempts at it anyway, there's a lot to enjoy here. Ironically, if you mix the hunt for a treasure and the villainous bad guys from Yankee Zephyr, the exotic location and ancient secrets of Sphinx, and the lighter tone and engaging protagonist of A Friend is a Treasure, you'd probably have something relatively close to an actual indie adventure. Or, much like everyone else from 81, you could just wait for the real thing. Once Raiders of the Lost Ark proved to be a massive hit, it didn't take long for the imitators and wannabes to start getting greenlit left, right and centre. The 80s are really the golden era for these sorts of things, back before audiences started growing tired of all these similar feeling adventures, and the budget started creeping up to the point of rarely being profitable. So if you're after gold, the early 80s are generally where it's at. Specifically, the 1982 direct-to-video film Gold Raiders. This Italian-Thai co-production isn't really an indie rip-off in the traditional sense, but the influence is clear, from the name of the film to a villain using a whip as his primary weapon. At its heart though, it's really a typical jungle war movie that has bad movie regular Robert Ginty teaming up with his old flame and a group of Filipino agents to retrieve $200 million in gold from a plane that's been shot down behind enemy lines in Thailand. So far, so typical 80s Italian movie. But what makes this film quote-unquote special is the audio, which is borderline student film made on a deadline levels of amateurish. I'm not even joking, it's like they recorded the footage without any sound at all and had to add in everything in post. And I don't think anyone provides their own voices. Ginty certainly doesn't. He's not known for being so emotional.
It's a high price to pay, isn't it? Makes you wonder whether it's all worth it.
So as a result, every line of dialogue just feels off. On top of that, the music will often just instantly switch to another piece whenever the shots change. So you'll have scenes where one tune is playing, then it suddenly cuts to a different one along with the footage. Only to cut back again a few seconds later. These issues make the film feel like it was cobbled together by aliens or someone completely new to filmmaking. And if you watch this, I swear, that'll be the big takeaway you get from it. That said, the audio may be what you'll remember most, but it's not the only thing of note about the film. There's also how weirdly bonkers it is. At one point, Ginty gets a motorcycle that's apparently made with the same stuff they use in spaceships, so naturally, it can fly. There's the underwater scenes that were clearly shot elsewhere, given how clear the water is. There's laughably fake vampire bats. There's a villain with a wooden leg. There's one of the most hilariously inappropriate musical stings I've ever heard.
You're the running dog of the communist imperialists!
There's a love scene that really didn't need to be here. There's hundreds of Russians getting mowed down in formation. There's so much nonsense it's hard to keep track. All this chaos adds up to a film that doesn't make a lick of sense, but is actually a ton of fun. If you're a fan of bad films, you should absolutely check this one out. Sadly, the only way to legally do so is by tracking down an original VHS, since it's never been officially re-released. Any DVDs you find are bootleg copies of a VHS rip, and also worthless, since said rip is on YouTube. God bless the Lost Movie Studio, they're doing the Lord's work. One last random fact about this, the German dub apparently turned this into a sequel to Robert Ginty's better-made film The Exterminator, complete with covers exclaiming, "The Exterminator Man is back," which is a feat in and of itself because Gold Raiders is about Ginty needing a gang into a jungle to retrieve a bunch of gold, while The Exterminator is about a completely unrelated vigilante in New York killing criminals with a flamethrower. The only similarities the two films have is that Ginty's in them. It'd be like making Rambo a sequel to Rocky, since, Stallone's in both, so why not? Also, there's an actual Exterminator 2, so yeah. Sticking with Italian films, the same year also gave us Hunters of the Golden Cobra, which is the first proper indie clone on this list, with a British intelligence officer and an American soldier teaming up with a mysterious woman to find the titular Golden Cobra, which may, or may not, but almost certainly does have mystical powers. Though that's only after an in medias res opening that starts the film running at a pace that it rarely slows down from. That pace and the general breeziness with which the movie treats its plot developments are the film's greatest strength, with the whole thing feeling like it has to hit all the cliches but doesn't really want to dwell on any of them, so it'll give a token mention to them and then just move on. A good example of that is when the American agent is injured in the jungle and presumed dead. The very next scenes are the British guy finding him, the pair having a fight, making peace, going to a briefing about the Golden Cobra, and the pair being tasked with finding it. Only for said meeting to be interrupted not just by magic footage, but also an assassin who's foiled and shot to death about 5,000 times. This all happens in the space of about 15 minutes. Most films would take their time with stuff like this, but the Golden Cobra is in a rush to get everything done in an hour and a half, so it's all go, go, go. Like I say though, this isn't actually a bad thing, because it gives the film an energy that many of these rip-offs lack. Often they'll take their time and spend ages in the jungle, or establishing a setting we don't really care about, usually to pad out the runtime. But that's not what this film does, and it's all the better for it. Even if something doesn't really work, like how the American is constantly getting beaten up, forcing the British guy to keep bailing him out, you've got very little time to dwell on it before something else is happening that requires your attention. Seriously though, the American is pretty rubbish. I'm not just saying that because I'm biased. In fact, to prove it, I'll point out that the British guy plays up his accent to the nth degree, which the actor does so much that it borders on irritating.
Captain David Franks, British Intelligence.
Thankfully, it never quite crosses that line, but it absolutely stands on the line and salutes the Queen for an hour or so. And if those are the worst things I can think to say about this, then it must be doing something right. Overall, it's a fun little romp that's surprisingly family-friendly. No bad language, no gratuitous nudity, barely any blood, and no gore at all. You'd expect an Italian film to be full of those, but not here. So, Hunters of the Golden Cobra is the first film on this list that actually received something resembling a follow-up, and setting the standard that this video will follow, I'm going to group things like these together into one entry over the alternative of constantly having to tell you that this film is a sequel to that one I talked about half an hour ago that you barely remember anything about. Yeah, I know my audience. That means we're jumping ahead to 1984's The Ark of the Sun God now, which isn't actually a sequel, but it has a lot of the same cast and crew, including the writer, the director, and the two lead actors, so I'm counting it as a follow-up even if it's only one in spirit. This time round, the American plays a master thief recruited by the English guy, who's now in a wheelchair, to find a scepter belonging to the God King Gilgamesh, best known to most for his multiple appearances in the Final Fantasy series. Or maybe that's just me. As you can imagine, they're not the only ones after the scepter, and all manner of complications ensue. As far as Italian rip-offs go, this one's also quite fun, as the American's character is a much more competent lead this time round, and starts the film with a girlfriend, meaning he doesn't develop a random love interest in the last 5 minutes, he makes for a much more entertaining protagonist, in what's honestly a slightly better film than Golden Cobra, even if it's not quite as fast-paced, and the first half is full of too many double crosses, bungled kidnap attempts, and characters constantly returning to the same locations, even when it's well established that they're unsafe. Fortunately, even if it's a bit silly at times, it's all still engaging. And if nothing else, the fact they use miniatures during some of the action sequences, such as the early car chase, only means they can do more destructive stunts than if they were using full-size vehicles, but it's also just adorable! Say what you will about this film, you will never see action film quite like this. Well, outside of anything filmed in Super Mario Nation, anyway. Sadly, none of the cast returns for the third film in this sort of series, Jungle Raiders. Although given the poor quality of my copy and how similar the new guys are to the old ones, you could quite easily have convinced me otherwise. A lot of the behind the camera team is the same though, including the director and writer, hence me covering it now. So no double act, but on the other hand, you've got Lee Van Cleef. I consider that an acceptable trade-off, even if he is barely in it. After a typical in medias res opening, albeit one that has a twist I kind of adored, our new lead is set up by Van Cleef to track down the Ruby of Doom, which sounds like something the director's kid came out with 5 minutes before they started filming, but as a catalyst for the plot, it does the job. What follows seems at first to be pretty much what you'd expect. Action, betrayals, chases, the usual, but it turns out to be more complicated than you'd think, with the betrayals coming all over the place, and the villain's plan being a little hard to understand. Of the 3 films in this sort of series, honestly, I'd say this one is the weakest. It's not bad by any stretch, and there's still plenty to enjoy about the film. The cast is pretty fun, the use of miniatures is as wonderful as last time, there's some great explosions, and the absurd antics with the Cobra are too ridiculous to even mention. But the uneven narrative and the awkward structure of the film means that I would consider it a little less enjoyable than the 2 that came before it. Third one's always the worst. Still, you could certainly do a lot worse than these 3 films, and if you want to imagine all 3 are connected, then it's perfectly doable with a little bit of headcanon. Jungle Raiders takes place in the 30s, so it obviously goes first. Then if you imagine the 2 leads having a son several years after the events of that film, that's the American character in Hunters. He ends that film hooking up with a girl who was lost in the jungle for 20 years. So if you say he chose to spend the majority of his rewards setting up new identities for the 2 to avoid things like the press, and then took up crime to maintain their lavish lifestyle, that leads quite nicely into Ark of the Sun God, the added benefit of ending the trilogy on the best of the 3. Moving back to 82, we're staying in the jungle, specifically for a crazy jungle adventure, or to give it its original name, Im Dschungel ist der Teufel los, which is poorly pronounced German. We're not going to see many German productions, and judging by this one, I'm genuinely conflicted whether I want to watch any more. Not because it's bad per se, but because it's so weird. Here's the setup. The bad guy is a criminal whose business is nearly broke, so he plans to have one of his planes crash so he can claim the insurance money, which would be fine if said plane didn't happen to be carrying a load of innocent passengers. Did I mention this is supposed to be a comedy? As you'd guess from the title, the plane crashes in the middle of a jungle, so it's up to the pilots, one of whom was blackmailed into flying the plane, just in case the bad guy wasn't evil enough for you already, to lead the passengers to an abandoned lodge, where they basically move in, hoping to be rescued, all the while dealing with the surprisingly friendly local wildlife. While the film isn't terrible, it suffers from the same problem as A Friend is a Treasure, i.e. it's not funny. But that film still worked because the 2 leads were at least charming and you were relatively happy to spend time in their company. Here you've got around a dozen people in the group of survivors and many of them seem quite irritating. The girl who likes pranking people, the priest who never shuts up about religious stuff, the guy with a camcorder who keeps trying to film everything, the disapproving mother of the girl instantly smitten with the nice boy, the comic relief air steward. The idea of spending over an hour with these people is quite off-putting. Fortunately, because there are so many people, we don't actually spend too long with any one of them, and after their initial introduction, they do tone things down to much more acceptable levels. Plus, the black male pilot, ostensibly the lead, is fun enough. There are somehow a few moments that got brief chuckles from me, and credit where it's due, they actually filmed on location with real animals, like lions and tigers and bears. Oh my! Actually, there's no bears, but there are elephants and rhinos, and porcupines, camels, and seals, which I don't think are native to the jungle, but either way, this is something many of these types of films need stock footage to show, despite often being filmed in the actual jungle, and you'd be surprised how much more interesting it makes things, especially here where the animals have some pretty neat interactions with the survivors. On the other hand, there are several moments that really did not age well, such as the black kid having a cigarette, which he then gives to a chimpanzee. Good luck trying that these days. There's also a weird 5 or 10 minute section with a lot of very unnecessary swearing, with the S-bomb being parroted quite a bit by a parrot. It's really odd because the barrage of foul language means that the film isn't really suitable for children, which contrasts with the attempts at physical comedy seemingly aimed at them. It's all very confusing, to the point that I don't know who this film is for. Maybe that's just a result of a very bizarre English dub, but it worked better in German?
Alles okay! Alles Quatsch! Alles Quatsch!
Additionally, the whole film is very tonally inconsistent. Sometimes it's a gentle comedy that isn't funny, sometimes it's deeply uncomfortable. And then there's the end where it swings between both seemingly every few seconds. I've never seen people attacked by lions in a sequence where it's both hilarious and horrifying. And after all that, not a single drop of blood is spilled since the people attacked are absolutely fine, despite being mauled by lions. I honestly can't decide whether this is good or not. It's so bafflingly weird that I'd almost recommend giving it a watch, but at the same time, the plot is so threadbare, the comedy's so weak, and the tone's so all over the place, I can't really recommend it to anyone. It's a real oddity. Let's try another jungle adventure in a more traditional vein. Invaders of the Lost Gold share similarities with Gold Raiders, in that it's about a group heading into hostile territory, the Philippines this time, to retrieve a lost shipment of gold while everyone is really awkwardly dubbed. The big difference here is that rather than being a government-sanctioned mission to stop the gold falling into enemy hands, here it's just a greedy son of a bitch who wants to get rich, killing one of the 3 survivors of the gold's original handlers when they refuse to lead him back to it, and causing a second to commit seppuku rather than do so, because he's that big an arse. Fortunately, the final survivor, Harold Sakata, is more agreeable, though he forgot to pack his razor-rimmed bowler hat. You know, because he's odd job. And with a few more people eventually recruited, the expedition is assembled and gets underway, at which point the film nosedives and becomes one of the dumbest movies I've ever seen. I wish I were joking, I really do, but some of the merry band of people gathered to go after the gold are the stupidest protagonists you could possibly imagine. One in particular tries to seduce a former flame, even though our current husband is another member of the party. A husband she then gets killed when, despite him clearly telling her not to move, she screams and knocks his tent down, meaning he gets fatally bitten by a snake. This is only the first of several easily preventable deaths brought about because the gang have a staggering lack of common sense, and it makes for an absolutely infuriating experience watching all this unfold. Not helping matters is how these deaths, and what little action there is at all in this movie, are edited, which is reminiscent of how they try to edit around the crocodiles in Temple of Doom, only eating clothes and not actual people. Only worse. Much, much worse. My favourite happens when someone's skinny dipping, and hopefully the picture quality is bad enough that I can get away with this on YouTube, but 1 second she's fine, suddenly slow motion shot of her screaming in the water, and then she's dead. How did she die? I don't know. Not even the film knows. It's so bad. Once you take the stupid protagonists and awful editing out of the equation, you're actually left with a film that's surprisingly dull. The characters boat around, they walk, they talk, they camp, someone dies, they bury them, and then they do it all again. The group starts with 8 main characters, and by the time they find the gold, they're down to 3, with each death being more inept than the last. I'd say it's hilariously bad, but it's really not. It's just bad. Plain and simple. Maybe we need a little star power to get things back on track, and who better than Charlton Heston? Well, lots of people to be honest, but whatever, let's take a look at Motherload Now, which had him in both the director's chair and starring as 2 of the main characters of the film. This is a passion project for the Heston family, make no mistake. Charlton's son Fraser wrote and produced the film, as well as doing some uncredited directing, and Heston's daughter Lydia was a still photographer on the project. It also appears to have been a slightly low-budget affair, despite the Hollywood gloss, with a stunt gone wrong having to be written into the film due to an inability to reshoot it. Ironically, that plane crash is an action highlight of what's otherwise a slow, drawn-out thriller of a movie, which isn't at all what I was expecting considering it's supposedly an indie ripoff. It isn't, at all, but I guess it seems a little like one when you look at the synopsis, where 2 people try to track down a man who's gone missing while hunting for gold, only to crash their plane and team up with Heston's miner to hopefully make it out in one piece. It's Heston himself who's the big draw here, shockingly enough, and as weird as it is for him to be playing the miner as Scottish, it does make for a pretty engaging character, along with the tics and quirks of a man who's supposedly been on his own mining silver for 30 years. See if you can guess the twist. It's a shame the 2 supposed leads, one of which is a before-she-was-big Kim Basinger, are nowhere near as interesting as him, being fairly bland characters with very little to them. One's a teacher who's here for the missing man, the other's a pilot also after the missing guy. Since he's here, he'd kind of like some gold as well, and that's about all you get. Compare that to Heston and yeah, this is clearly his film. With all that said, you might be expecting me to say that this is a bad film, only serving as a star vehicle with little else to it, but honestly, I think it's a pretty good little movie. Though I do mean little, as it's a fairly small-scale story. It's not going to win any awards or anything, but it's a good story, told well, beautifully shot, they really show off British Columbia, and fairly well acted, especially by Heston. It's absolutely not what I was expecting when I went into this, but a good film is a good film. Just don't watch it if you're claustrophobic, those mine shafts are cramped. Speaking of small scale, let's move from the big screen to the small one. Falcons Gold, or Robbers of the Sacred Mountain as it was renamed once it made its way out of the US, was the very first original movie made for a cable network, specifically Showtime. Before this, networks primarily aired TV shows and could only show major films once they'd done their rounds in cinemas. But with Falcons Gold, they could entice potential audiences to sign up to their network with a feature film never seen before. That said, it did get a limited theatrical release in other countries where Showtime wasn't available. You had to pay for it either way, so whatever. Ironically, as a result of this, it's one of the more obscure films on this list to track down these days. The only home release it's ever gotten was on VHS and Betamax, and, well, current year argument, that's not going to cut it for a modern audience. It's also not really an option for me, because there is no way in hell I am getting hold of a VHS player and then linking it up to my laptop, figuring out a way to record footage. I'm not doing all that just for like 5 films. The only option available to me, and I suspect to most of you, is to find a ropey VHS rip of this film on YouTube, which sadly is not in English. Thankfully, it does have auto-translated subtitles, but YouTube being YouTube, those were let's say, hard work.
Maldita sea, es un abuso. No sé por qué he de quedarme atrás.
So, was it worth the effort? Well, no, obviously, but even if I'd found it in 1080p HD with a crystal clear English audio track, I still wouldn't have thought this was all that great. Plot-wise, it's fine, with the titular Falcon being Professor Christopher Falcon, an archaeologist played by John Marley in one of his last roles. He, along with his granddaughter, a journalist, and a mercenary, get caught up in the search for hidden artifacts that contain minerals taken from meteorites, which nefarious forces want for nefarious purposes. Because of course they do. Like I say, all of that sounds fine, though I fail to see how any of it relates to the Arthur Conan Doyle story the film's supposedly based on. But it's the execution that really lets things down, since it's filmed with all the care of, well, an of-the-time TV movie. The opening flashback serves more to confuse things than it does to set anything up, while the first proper action sequence, a punch-up in a museum, is laughable in how it's so poorly staged and awkwardly edited, with most of the other action scenes sadly being much the same. It all feels very ramshackle and awkward, which is really not what you want from your action scenes. Saving things from becoming unwatchable is the cast, who give this their all, and it frankly helps to elevate some relatively ropey material into something at least vaguely watchable. The journalist, played by Simon McCorkindale, who essentially becomes the lead once the expedition gets underway, making the title a bit of a misnomer, is actually quite resourceful, and the actor is pretty charming, so that helps immensely, and his female co-leads are equally enjoyable company. Especially the mercenary, who strips with alarming regularity, which I think is supposed to paper over her character's shocking lack of depth. She's meant to betray the team, but changes her mind the second the group gets into a gunfight, which is less than 10 minutes later. Depth? What's that? And lest I be accused of bias, McCorkindale also gets his fair share of scenes where he's barely wearing anything, so this film is equal opportunity in its fan service, if nothing else. Which actually brings up an interesting point, because the nudity in this film feels very at odds with the Sunday afternoon feel that the rest of the movie seems to be going for. Without the nudity, it'd be a simple family-friendly affair, since it's not bloody or sweary or anything, and it honestly feels a little shoehorned in, as if they knew it was being made for cable, so they had the adult lead stripped down to give it a little more spice. Overall, this isn't the worst film I've ever watched. Hell, it's not even the worst film of the ones I've covered thus far. But the direction's not great, the action is deeply underwhelming, and it all comes across a little cheap, which, had it just been a TV movie, probably would have been acceptable. But this was shown in cinemas, and frankly, on those terms, it does not hold up. The cast just about manages to salvage it, but you're not missing out if you skip it, especially if you have to watch it with pidgin English subtitles the same way I did. If you're really interested though, just wait until a week after this video comes out and they inevitably announce a Blu-ray release, solely to show me up. I know how these things work. Sticking with the small screen, there are actually two TV shows that started in '82 that tried to do bite-sized indie-style adventures on a weekly basis. Both only lasted a single season, unfortunately. TV shows didn't tend to get Netflix-sized budgets back in those days, so the fact network spent the amount they did on these two shows, which, amusingly enough, were both set in the 30s, so required expensive period-appropriate dressing, meant that if they didn't get, and keep, decent viewing figures, they'd be ripe for the chopping block. Which, sadly, is what happened. I say sadly because they're actually both kind of fun, if not exactly amazing. They're definitely better than you'd expect, anyway. These shows would be CBS's Bring 'Em Back Alive and ABC's Tales of the Gold Monkey, which ran for 17 and 22 episodes respectively. Bring 'Em Back Alive stars Bruce Boxleitner, of Babylon 5 and Tron, as a fictionalized version of real-life big game trapper Frank Buck. But if you're worried about what he does with the animals he traps, then you've clearly forgotten the name of the show.
I don't kill, Mr. Heinrich. I bring them back alive.
As a result, he spends quite a bit of time conflicting with more bloodthirsty hunters, among various other nefarious troublemakers, one of whom is introduced in the opening credits, so you know he's a wrong 'un. Buck's not alone, however, as he's often joined by Ali, his friend and number one boy, not like that, and Gloria Marlowe, who works the United States Consul. And since she's played by Cindy Morgan, that means we get something of a Tron reunion, which is a big plus in my book. As you'd expect from an 80s show on CBS, this is actually quite a light-hearted sort of affair, with Boxleitner being a very charming and likeable lead that seems to inspire everyone around him to give equally fun performances, even if they're not necessarily Oscar-worthy. It's just nice to watch Boxleitner hang out with his pals before getting roped into one adventure or another, whether that be helping to find an American agent in the jungle or track down an elusive white elephant, which is basically his Moby Dick. I see what they did there. There's really no over-the-top violence or gore or anything all that objectionable, really. Unless you count the "it was the 30s and that's just how things were" attitude the show has, with things like smoking, depictions of cultures, that sort of thing. But even then, it's hardly offensive. It's just a fun, surprisingly family-friendly show that has Boxleitner get threatened by a monkey wielding a gun in the first episode, which he fobs off with a banana. So, you know, that's the kind of show it is. Since the series starts with 2 connected stories, that makes the first 2 episodes essentially a mini 80 or 90-minute movie, which I would normally recommend people check out to see whether the show's their sort of thing. Unfortunately, unless you feel like watching the first few episodes in potato vision on YouTube, the only way to watch it properly is to buy the whole series on DVD. This is frustrating because I genuinely do think it's the kind of show you need to sample before committing to the whole thing. It's a pretty slight show overall, and that's really not going to be for everyone. So being able to watch the first few episodes on something like Netflix to see whether it's for you would have been perfect. As is though, I don't know. Anyway, Tales of the Gold Monkey is, like Bringing Back Alive, a fairly light show, and is also only available on DVD these days, so again, it's hard to actually recommend, because it's also one I think you need to try before you buy, so to speak. The first feature-length episode is a good indication of the show as a whole, and is the only one to actually feature the titular Gold Monkey, making it an artifact title if ever there was one, since the rest of the show is largely a series of unconnected romps about whatever adventure of the week they could come up with. Speaking of, the show follows pilot Jake Cutter, his mechanic friend Corky, and his one-eyed dog Jack, who steals every scene he's in, as you'd expect, through various adventures on his seaplane, usually involving US spy Sarah Stickney White. Occasionally opposing him are the 100% culturally sensitive, honest Japanese princess Koji, along with their bodyguard Todo, and the Nazi spy Wiley, who poses as a priest who likes to bless the female natives. Despite them being the villains, you can't really hate any of them. They're so over the top and ridiculous, it's just fun. Provided you can get over the unintentional racism of things like a Panamanian American actress playing a Japanese woman and the Bushido outfits being made out of plastic by the looks of it. Honestly, the whole show has a slight feel of things being thrown together, despite there being quite a bit of location work and such. It's mostly down to how the stuff shot on sound stages are really obvious. Jungles are clearly artificial, to say nothing of the animal attacks being laughably unconvincing, and large sections take place on a seaplane that's very obviously a set. You can clearly tell the stagehands are just throwing water over the front of it whenever it lands. You'd think this would be a major detriment, but honestly it's just kind of charming, which I'd say is the main draw of the show. It's a fairly likeable series of romps that sadly end up feeling a little bit repetitive when watched in bulk. On a week-to-week basis, as originally aired, this wouldn't be an issue, but again, you can only get it on DVD now, and when you do that, you tend to consume shows in much quicker succession. I tend to binge an entire disc at a time, for example. So the sameness sets in a lot quicker. Bringing Back Alive suffered from that a little as well, but I think it's much more an issue with Gold Monkey, especially given how there's more of it. As I said earlier, Bringing Back Alive had 17 episodes, while Gold Monkey has 22. Combined with the more studio-bound feel of the show, Gold Monkey sadly wears out its welcome a lot quicker. Again though, it's that issue of availability that really brings things down, and it's why I struggle to recommend either show. With a film, you're in it for anywhere from 80 minutes to 2.5 hours. With a TV show, you've got anywhere up to 18 hours per season, which is a lot to ask of someone. It's why I keep harping on about trying the first couple of episodes to see if you're up for that kind of investment, and the fact you can't really do that is a real annoyance. Bringing Back Alive, like I say, is in super poor quality on YouTube, and although I found episodes of Gold Monkey on Dailymotion, it was in German, so not ideal. I'm going to bring up Crunchyroll as an example, if you'll forgive the brief diversion. If you don't know, Crunchyroll is an anime streaming service, and they'll often upload the first episode of a show in its entirety onto its YouTube channel. That's a great idea. It lets you get a feel for the show as a whole, and if you like it, then hey, check the description and there's a handy link to the whole season over at Crunchyroll. Everyone wins. I wish TV networks, streaming services I suppose it is now, would do something similar rather than just give out brief clips that don't really do a good job at demonstrating the show as a whole. Or worse, use trailers that can often be misleading. Instead, shows like this are a bit of a gamble, and that's a tough sell. Ultimately though, these are fun shows, as I say, but whether you'll want to fork out to watch an entire season of them, that's down to you, I guess. Finally moving on to 1983, we do so with Diamonds of Kilimanjaro, also known as El Tesoro de la Diosa Blanca, or the Treasure of the White Goddess. I'm assuming the treasure is supposedly how the White Goddess, and the Black one for that matter, are topless throughout their entire on-screen presence in the movie, but given how it's presented so matter-of-factly, it's not tantalizing in the slightest. I bring that up because this is the first film on this list that is 100% not family-friendly. Crazy Jungle Adventure had a brief 10-minute spot where it wasn't, but most of the movie was fine for kids, and while both Invaders of the Lost Gold and Robbers of the Sacred Mountain had some brief nudity, it was brief. Not so with this one. That White Goddess, who crashed in the jungle while young, along with her godfather, is here to be found, rescued, killed. And given the actress was 16 when this film was made, that makes the fact that she's permanently topless really uncomfortable. Like I say, not family-friendly. I mentioned killing because the group sent to find her have several different motives among them. Some genuinely want to rescue her, some want to kill her so they can get the inheritance she's due, and some are only interested in the diamonds that are found in the area she lives on. You'd think all this would make the film at least somewhat interesting, but alas, it does not. This is a film that needs nudity, both male and female, because it's not got anything else going for it, and even then the nudity is not exciting because it's shot like a National Geographic documentary. Actually, the way the film's put together needs a little exploration because the editing completely screws things up at certain points. Footage is sometimes taken from later in the movie and inserted into the film at an earlier point, often without sound, making it feel incredibly random. Did you want a romantic scene interrupted by a random shot of a rhino? That's here. How about a woman almost getting eaten by a crocodile while she's swimming, without audio, only to immediately go back into the water to do it all over again with audio? Is this an editing cock-up? If so, how the hell do you let something like that slip through? And if it was deliberate, what the hell kind of creative choice is that? Frankly, I think I've said all I need to about this film, but I'll rattle off a few other problems just to get them out of the way. The music is absurdly terrible, the stock footage is laughably noticeable, the dubbing is just plain awful, and at one point the topless 16-year-old girl watches a couple have awkward, uncomfortable looking sex, which she imitates later by seducing the same man, despite being 16, and him visibly being old enough to be her father. It's deeply uncomfortable in a film that also has a downer of an ending where everyone who went on the journey dies, meaning that absolutely nothing was achieved, and if everyone had just stayed at home, they'd have had the exact same result with the added benefit of being alive, which always makes for a satisfying realization. And for one last failure, despite everywhere online saying the film's 83 minutes long, that's a lie. It's actually 95. We get 10 extra minutes of this rubbish. Joy. Look, if you want to watch porn, there's plenty out there. If you want to watch a good movie, there's plenty of those as well. This is neither. Don't bother. And they don't even go to Kilimanjaro. Ugh. Back to Hollywood for something at least a bit more tasteful now. As many of you probably know already, Harrison Ford wasn't the first choice to play Indy. The role was originally given to Tom Selleck. Unfortunately, Selleck had also filmed a pilot for a CBS show called Magnum P.I., and when CBS decided to pick that up as a full series, Selleck was ultimately forced to withdraw from Raiders before filming began, with Harrison Ford being cast at relatively short notice. In the long run, I think things worked out pretty well for both actors, but for those who are curious to see what Selleck would be like in this sort of role, and don't want to watch an Uncanny Valley deepfake, seriously, it's impressive but still kinda creepy, there's High Road to China, adapted from the book of the same name, but bearing very little in common with it. Selleck plays a pilot during World War I hired to take a rich heiress to find her father, before he's legally declared dead and she actually has to get a job, which might do her some good given the spoilt, carefree high life she seems to live. Still, as long as she keeps her top on. Actually, despite an unfavourable first impression, she's not as much of a rich bitch as she seems, which is good, since not only do we spend most of the film with her, it just makes her a better protagonist. She and Selleck work pretty well together in what's essentially a road trip sort of movie, just with planes. They fly to a place, get into some shenanigans, they go somewhere else, shenanigans, you get the idea. Those shenanigans aren't super epic or anything, despite hiring a lot of extras and the occasional familiar face for them, but they're entertaining enough, and overall, despite not being as good as an indie adventure, it's still a perfectly fine film, even if it does end with a lot of plot threads barely resolved. The main issue of money is dealt with through very basic dialogue, but one of their companions is stranded in a foreign country, the leads never get the father to go back to England, the whole point of the journey in the first place, and even the main villain of the film is barely mentioned past the 2/3 mark. It feels like another 5 or 10 minutes at the end of the film properly wrapping everything up would have gone a long way, along with another few minutes actually depicting the journeys between countries, which are somewhat glossed over. Like I say, the film's not bad, but it does feel like it's missing a few components to make it a really great adventure. As for Selleck, while it's a shame he didn't get to play Indy proper, he did kind of do so in the final season of Magnum P.I. in an episode called Legend of the Lost Art. And while it's fun, it also kind of shows that, like I say, I think things turned out for the best with this one. Selleck doesn't quite have that grizzled edge that Harrison Ford does. He feels a little too friendly, and I really struggle to picture him getting the crap kicked out of him or causing someone to get killed in a rock crusher. Unlike with Harrison, who nails the part so hard it's like he was born for it. And hey, Selleck got to meet Jessica Fletcher, so it worked out pretty well in the end. Sticking with big names, how about Tommy Lee Jones? He starred in Savage Islands, which is more well known as Nathan Hayes, presumably to avoid confusion with the horror film Savage Island Singular that came out a couple of years later. Nathan Hayes is a terrible name for the record. Is it a sitcom about a pair of lazy roommates, or a Pirates of the Caribbean style movie that has absolutely no sense of pacing? Well, it's the latter, obviously, I wouldn't have been so specific, but you get the point. Savage Islands is the better name. In case it wasn't clear, I don't think this is a very good film, which is disappointing because Tommy Lee Jones is easily the best thing about it, and it's a real shame he's attached to such a failure. He's essentially the Captain Jack Sparrow here. If that sounds like fun, then imagine Captain Jack if he was going through detox and you've got a better sense of Jones's performance. Dial down your expectations is basically what I'm saying. The plot is actually like a watered down version of the first Pirates of the Caribbean. Normal guy has to team up with pirate to rescue his kidnapped love interest, shenanigans ensue, normal guy develops a backbone and wins girl over, yada yada yada. What really kills this film, as I said, is the pacing. It's pretty drawn out and lacks any real flow, meaning there's long stretches where very little actually happens. Coupled with how uninteresting the action scenes are when they do show up, and you've got a pretty weak film that's not helped by some very weird characterization for the normal guy. Considering he's supposed to be a missionary of sorts, he mans up surprisingly quickly, and rather than argue over which of them the girl should be with, he and Jones keep trying to say she should be with the other one instead of themselves, then generously agree to let the girl decide who she wants to be with, which, aside from just being gross in general, one of them's a pirate, albeit a nice one, and the other's a missionary, but they're both acting like college roommates arguing over who gets to sleep with the girl they both like. Maybe Nathan Hayes is the more appropriate name. In the end though, all of this is utterly superfluous when, as I say, we live in a world where Pirates of the Caribbean is basically a better version of this in every way that matters. As well as the pacing being poor, the action is weak, the characters are weird, the plot is surprisingly basic, the villain is cartoonishly evil, and the depictions of jungle natives is very questionable, to the point they tie the love interest to an offering statue and have her be lowered into a volcano, which is eerily familiar. Temple of Doom came out the year after this, for the record. Oh, and did I mention the film's a flashback? Yeah, the movie has such a slow start that they had to invent a framing device solely so they could have an action scene at the beginning, and one at the end that you can totally see coming a mile away because it is basically identical to Pirates of the Caribbean, though I can't exactly blame this film for that. Not only is it super awkward, but it also means we know the villain doesn't die when we're supposed to think he does, so it's a bad story device on top of everything else the film does wrong. Throw this one overboard, it's dead weight. One last big name for 83, but it's not an actor, it's a studio. If you're familiar with Cannon Group, then them doing an Indiana Jones style adventure isn't a great stretch, and if you're not familiar with them, well, then you're missing out on a lot of quote-unquote great 80s action schlock. Their output may not necessarily be high art, but I'll be damned if most of it isn't a lot of fun. Treasure of the Four Crowns was Cannon trying to jump on the bandwagon like no other, right down to having a gimmicky 3D version, here called WandaVision, that you can still experience today on Blu-ray if you're willing to wear those cardboard glasses. But even if I hadn't known that fact ahead of time, it's blatantly obvious this was made to be a 3D film from how things fly at the screen, or people look like they're about to poke you in the eye all the time. And because watching the film in 2D is dull as ditchwater. This is not Cannon at their best. It doesn't help when the film starts with a text crawl, which totally doesn't look familiar, that as well as being hard to read, spouts utter nonsense, and is followed up by a fairly bored-looking treasure hunter wearing the most 80s winter jacket I've ever seen, doing his thing in what looks like a high school play's rendition of an ancient castle, with an absurd number of animals, some of which are clearly made of cardboard, way too much slow motion, and most bizarrely projectiles flying at him that are shown 2 or 3 times. Very bizarre. Bizarre and terrible. When your film opens with an unbelievably cheap-looking 20 minutes, you don't look forward to the remaining 80. Sadly, things don't really get much better when the treasure hunter starts assembling a crew to go after 2 of the titular crowns, despite the name of the film suggesting there's 4. Technically there were, but one was destroyed prior to the events of the film, and the good guys already have the 4th. I guess someone on the production team really liked the name Four Crowns. That recruitment process reveals one of the guys has a heart problem and another is a drunk. And yes, that is poorly set up foreshadowing, however did you guess? And then it's on to discuss how they're going to infiltrate the cult that has the crowns, with a hilariously absurd model of their castle. It's a perfect replica with lights and alarms and everything. When did they have time to build this? What was wrong with some blueprints? Oh, it's so dumb. I wish the rest of the film was this amusingly bad, but alas, from there it's just dull until the very end, which is so absurdly bonkers I have no idea what to make of it. It certainly doesn't make up for the rest of the film, which feels like it was cobbled together in a rush, and the 2D version shows how rubbish the effects are. Even in a VHS rip, you can see the strings on some of the flying objects. It really does feel like it was made by amateurs, which is bizarre as the guys behind it kicked off the whole 80s 3D craze with Coming At Ya, so you'd think they'd be better at it than this. Maybe they really were just rushing to get it out before the craze died. And if that's the case, they failed. This was the last big 3D film to come out in the 80s, and it bombed. Hard. Frankly, it deserved to. Well, 1983 was a bit of a wash, but fortunately, 1984 brought us one of the more well-known Indiana Jones-like films, Romancing the Stone, along with its sequel from the following year, Jewel of the Nile. Both are big-budget Hollywood affairs starring Michael Douglas, Kathleen Turner, and Danny DeVito. And honestly, while the first film is well worth a watch, the second one, not so much. Brought to us by Robert Zemeckis, yes, the guy behind Back to the Future, that first film cast Douglas as a down-on-his-luck rogue who saves and is eventually hired by Kathleen Turner's romance novelist, whose books, based on what little we hear of them, I would hate, to help find her sister, who was kidnapped in Colombia by Danny DeVito and his cousin as part of a complicated hunt to track down the titular stone. Though as you'd expect, they're not the only ones after it. Having such a likeable cast means that the 2 leads are pretty fun to watch, especially Douglas because he's kind of an arsehole to Turner at first, but he's a pretty entertaining arsehole and it's well deserved, since Turner is completely out of her depth and should have known that from the minute she got the ransom demand. She's a writer, not an archaeologist, Jim. And you'd expect both characters have hidden depths and learn to respect, then fall in love with each other, and like I say, they work really well together, so the hour or so you spend with them together fly by pretty quickly as they go through all the sorts of shenanigans you'd expect from a film like this. Really, the one who gets the short straw is Danny DeVito, because he doesn't get to do a whole lot. He's mostly the slightly inept villain who keeps getting waylaid until a very lucky break 2/3 through the film. He's not bad or anything, he's Danny freaking DeVito. He's just barely in the film, which is kind of a shame. Still, on the whole, the film is pretty great and, like I said before, well worth tracking down. Sadly, while the first film was a pretty good time all round, the sequel was an absolute nightmare to put together. Hell, the behind-the-scenes problems are more entertaining to hear about than actually watching the film itself. Don't expect the director to talk about them in the commentary track for the film, which I listened to, because instead he's just talking about how great everyone was. That is not true. I won't get into a great deal of detail, but when the director and writer of the first film didn't return, they were replaced by much less experienced ones, resulting in a weaker film right off the bat. But the film shoot in Morocco was beset with problems, largely because corruption was rampant among Moroccan officials, and from what I've learned, the whole affair was awful from start to finish. As for the finished product, it's kind of your typical Hollywood sequel. Bigger, badder, bloated. This time round, Turner's got writer's block because of all our romantic getaways with Douglas. Apparently, you can't write a romantic happy ever after when you live it and realise it gets kind of dull after a while. Some author she turned out to be. As such, she leaps at the chance to write the biography of an Egyptian sheik, who's clearly a bad guy, but as we've established, she's not exactly the brightest bulb in the box, so doesn't realise this until it's too late, forcing Douglas and DeVito to team up and save her while also going for the titular jewel, who turns out to be a person and the only one who can bring about the downfall of the sinister sheik. Part of the problem with this film is that when the two romantic leads are together, they're often bickering, because hey, that's fun, right? While their bickering in the first film was quite charming, here it's just annoying. And as a result, the movie as a whole lacks the dynamic chemistry of the original, which was a major reason why that one works so well. There's also DeVito's character, who essentially forces himself into a bigger role despite not having any real reason to be there and not really doing all that much that couldn't have been achieved by someone else. He's the comic relief character in a film that, sadly, isn't particularly funny. It's not all bad, the action's pretty fun, the actors are all clearly trying, and the pacing's pretty good. It's just a shame the script is so lacking. But hey, at least we got the classic song, when the going gets tough, the tough gets going out of it. Yes, this film is where that song originated. As for the franchise, yeah, it's done by this point. 2 potential sequels were discussed over the years, but they never ended up happening. And then there was talk of a reboot, then morphed into a TV show, but that seems to have gone quiet as well. I don't know, maybe we should just let these kids have their happy ending, eh? From romance to science fiction now, the one genre you probably weren't expecting to see on this list, and for good reason.